Can a cannonball change the course of a life, and with it, the history of the Church? In 1521, a young and ambitious soldier named Inigo de Loyola was wounded in the Battle of Pamplona with a shattered leg. That blow, which seemed to be the end of all his dreams of military glory, was actually the beginning of his true life. During the long recovery, with no reading material other than the life of Christ and the saints, his heart was conquered by a king greater than all the kings of the earth. From that wounded soldier would arise Saint Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus and Master of Souls. Let us accompany him on his amazing path of conversion. Before we begin, tell us in the comments from which city or country you are joining us today. We are glad to know how far the devotion to Saint Ignatius reaches. And if you have an intention in your heart, a decision you need to make, a conversion you long for, a grace you need, leave it in the comments as your prayer request. Let us place all those intentions under the protection of this great saint. If this story strengthens your faith, stay with us until the end. In the year 1491, in the castle of Loyola, in the Basque country of northern Spain, the youngest of 13 siblings from a noble family was born. He was named Inigo. He belonged to an ancient and honorable noble house, accustomed to arms and service to the crown. From childhood, he breathed the atmosphere of the warrior nobility of his time, with its ideals of honor, bravery, and fame. Nothing suggested that the boy would one day be elevated to sainthood. While still young, Inigo was sent to serve as a page and courtier in the household of a high-ranking official of the kingdom. There, he was trained in court manners, in dealing with the great, in handling weapons, and in the arts of pleasing. He was handsome, spirited and strong-willed, fond of finery, tournaments, and heroic deeds. He dreamed of distinguishing himself, of gaining honor and renown, like the knights in the novels he loved so much. In those years, he was not a pious young man. The saint himself would later humbly confess that until the age of 26, he had been a man devoted to the vanities of the world, eager for fame, fond of games, duels of honor, and carnal pleasures. His heart was full of earthly ambition, seeking his glory in arms and in the esteem of men. In short, he lived like many young men of his condition and time. And yet, there was a hidden nobility in that worldly heart, a capacity for dedication and greatness that was just waiting to be directed toward its true end. Inigo was generous, brave, capable of giving everything for an ideal. The problem was not in the strength of his soul, but in the goal to which it was directed. He devoted his great energies to a small and fleeting glory, that of the world, without suspecting that God destined him for an infinitely greater glory. He fully embraced the military career, serving as a soldier and man of war. He craved battles, dangers, opportunities to show his valor and gain honor. That was his life and passion. The military, the court, fame. A path that seemed predetermined and that he traveled with enthusiasm, without pondering deeper questions about the meaning of his existence. But God, who writes straight with crooked lines, had other plans for that ambitious soldier, and he wanted to change his life, precisely what Inigo loved most, a battle. In the walls of a besieged city, a single moment would split his existence in two. That day, everything he had dreamed would collapse, and from its ruins, a new man would begin to rise. Let's see what happened in Pamplona. It was the year 1521 when the French troops besieged the city of Pamplona in the kingdom of Navarra. The garrison defending it was small, and many advised surrender in the face of the enemy's clear superiority. But among the defenders was Inigo de Loyola, and his soldier's heart could not conceive of surrender. With his fervor and eloquence, he inspired others to resist, and he prepared to defend the fortress until the end, even at the cost of his life. In the heat of battle, a cannonball fired by the French struck him severely, shattering one leg and injuring the other. Inigo fell, and with him fell the spirits of the defenders, who soon surrendered. That brave soldier who dreamed of the glory of arms now lay on the ground, badly wounded, with his dreams shattered like his own leg. The blow that seemed like the end of everything was, in reality, the beginning of his true story. The French, admiring his valor, treated him courteously and sent him back to his castle in Loyola to recover. The journey, under those conditions and through difficult paths, was tormenting. Upon arrival, the doctors found that the leg had been poorly splintered, requiring it to be broken again and reset. Inigo endured those extremely painful surgeries without today's pain relief methods, with a fortitude that amazed everyone. Still moved by vanity, when he saw a bone protruding and marring his leg, he asked to have it cut off so he could continue wearing the fashionable fitted trousers like a knight. He was still an old man, enslaved to appearances and worldly honor. This desire to please and to show off reveals how much he remained trapped by the vanities of the age. But God was going to use that long immobility to speak to his heart. For the convalescence was long, very long. Inigo lay bedridden for months, unable to move, condemned to stillness, he who was all action and movement. For a man like him, that forced confinement was a harsh trial. To distract himself from the tedium, he sought what had always excited him, chivalric books, adventure and romance novels that fed his dreams of glory. And here, Providence intervened in a simple yet decisive way. In the castle of Loyola, there were none of those novels he requested. They only found for him two very different books, a life of Christ and a book about the lives of the saints. Inigo, in the absence of anything else, began to read them without much enthusiasm, just to pass the time. He didn't know that those pages were going to change his life forever. Let us pause to consider the silent miracle that took place in his soul. At first, Inigo read those books out of mere necessity, without devotion. But little by little, the words began to enter his heart. He read the life of Christ, contemplated his works and his passion. He read the deeds of the saints, the penances of Saint Francis of Assisi, the zeal of Saint Dominic, and something began to stir within him. Those men had also been brave. They had undertaken great enterprises, but for a much greater king, and for a glory that does not fade away. Then, in the silence of his bed, he began to alternate between two types of thoughts. Sometimes he dreamed, as before, of the feats of the world, arms, fame, the love of a great lady, the honors he would win. Other times he dreamed of imitating the saints, doing penance, pilgrimage to Jerusalem, serving God with great works. Both dreams kept him entertained while he had them, but Inigo, an attentive man, noticed a difference that would be decisive. He realized that when he dreamed of worldly things, he enjoyed it while thinking about it, but afterward felt dry, empty, and discontented. In contrast, when he dreamed of imitating the saints and serving God, not only did he enjoy thinking about it, but afterward he felt filled with peace, joy, and lasting comfort. That simple observation was a light. Inigo understood that there were different spirits that moved his heart, and that the peace that remained came from God. This was the seed of what he would later call the discernment of spirits, one of the greatest treasures he would leave to the Church. He learned to read the inner movements of the soul, to distinguish what leads to God from what takes one away from him, not just by the pleasure of the moment, but by the fruit they leave behind. The good spirit brings true peace and comfort. The bad spirit, although it flatters at first, ultimately leaves restlessness and emptiness. Thus Inigo began to discern the will of God. From those readings and those inner struggles, a firm resolution was born to leave the life of the world and dedicate himself entirely to God, imitating the saints. Inigo decided to change his banner, his king, and his army. He would no longer serve the lords of the land, but Christ, the eternal King. He would no longer seek his own glory, but the glory of God. The conversion was made deep in his heart, and he only awaited to manifest it through actions. In his soul, without a doubt, resonated that question from the gospel that summarizes all conversion. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul? Matthew 16:26. Inigo had sought the whole world and he had found it empty. Now he would seek the only thing necessary. As soon as he recovered enough to walk, he set out to leave the castle of Loyola and begin his new life. His first destination would be a sanctuary of the Virgin, where he would solemnly seal his commitment. Let's go with him to Montserrat. Recovered from his wounds, Inigo left the castle of Loyola, ready to start a new life. His heart burned with desires for penance and dedication, although he still did not know exactly which path he would follow. He set his course towards the Holy Land, intending to pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But first, he wanted to stop at a place very dear to Spanish piety, the sanctuary of Our Lady of Montserrat, perched in the mountains of Catalonia. Along the way, he gradually shed the old man. In a gesture full of meaning, he gave his rich knightly garments to a poor man and dressed himself in a coarse pilgrim's robe, cinched with a rope. The noble gentleman became a beggar for the love of Christ. That change of clothing was the visible sign of a much deeper transformation. Inigo renounced his rank, his fortune, and his honor to embrace the poverty and humility of the gospel. Upon arriving at Montserrat, he prepared meticulously for his new life. He made a general confession of all the sins of his past existence in writing over 3 days, placing his entire soul in God's hands. He wanted to start anew, purified and reconciled, leaving no burdens behind. That confession was like a second baptism, in which he washed away the stains of his years of vanity and sin. And then the solemn moment arrived. Like the knights who kept vigil over their arms the night before being knighted, Inigo spent an entire sleepless night before the revered image of Our Lady of Montserrat, the Moreneta. But his vigil was not to take up arms, but to lay them down. Before the Virgin, he hung up his sword and dagger, the weapons of his former life as a soldier, offering them as one who lays down all violence and worldly glory at the feet of the Mother of God. That gesture is of a moving beauty. The soldier who had dreamed of conquering earthly battles now surrendered himself to a greater Lord, placing his sword at the feet of the Queen of Heaven. He would no longer fight with iron weapons, but with the weapons of the Spirit: prayer, penance, humility, and charity. He was enlisting in a new military service, that of Christ, to combat not against men, but against sin, and for the salvation of souls. Stripped of everything and turned into a poor pilgrim, Inigo descended from Montserrat and headed to a small nearby town called Manresa, thinking he would stop there for just a few days before continuing on to Jerusalem. But God kept him in that place for nearly a year, where he worked some of the greatest graces in his soul throughout his life. Manresa would be the forge where the spiritual master would be shaped. Inigo stopped in Manresa by the banks of the Cardona River, and what was supposed to be a brief stop turned into a stay of almost 11 months. There, he led a life of strict penance. He begged for his bread from door to door, fasted, disciplined himself, let his hair and nails grow in contempt of former vanity, and spent long hours in prayer, sometimes in a secluded cave where he withdrew alone with God. Those months were not, however, purely sweet. God allowed Inigo to go through extremely difficult inner trials. He was beset by anguishing scruples about his past sins, doubts, deep sadness, and temptations of despair, to the point of feeling tempted to end his life. It was a dark night of the soul, a terrible spiritual battle, but Inigo, holding on to God, persevered in prayer and trust, and from that crucible emerged purified and strengthened. Having passed the tests, the Lord began to shower him with extraordinary graces. Inigo received wonderful insights to understand the mysteries of faith, the Holy Trinity, the Eucharist, and the work of creation. His soul, once occupied with the vanities of the world, was now filled with the wisdom of God. These graces were not the result of his studies, as he was still an unlettered man, but a free gift from the Holy Spirit, who directly instructed his servant. The most famous of those graces came to him one day by the banks of the Cardona River. While walking absorbed, the eyes of his understanding were suddenly opened, and he comprehended and felt the things of God and faith with such depth that he later said he learned more in that single moment than in his entire life. That illumination transformed him from within. He left there, he said, as a new man, with a different understanding. From all that experience, from his struggles and his comforts, Inigo took note. He wrote down what he felt in his soul, the ways to pray, the rules for discerning spirits, the paths to order life and seek the will of God. Those notes, born from his own experience, would eventually become his most precious work, the spiritual exercises. In Manresa, unknowingly, he was writing the book that would help millions of souls find God. When he left Manresa, Inigo was no longer the same. He had entered as a converted soldier and emerged as a master of the Spirit, a man transformed by the hand of God. He carried in his heart and in his notes a treasure that still needed to mature. Before delivering that treasure to the church, however, he wanted to fulfill his long-held desire to walk on the ground that Jesus had walked. But we must first pause at the work that was born in Manresa, for it is the key to his entire life and legacy. The spiritual exercises are undoubtedly Saint Ignatius's greatest legacy to the Church. They are not a book to read, but a method for prayer and transforming life, a guide for undertaking over a few weeks of retreat and silence, an inner journey of conversion. Just as one exercises the body to strengthen it, those who do the exercises exercise the soul in prayer and penance to free themselves from disordered affections and seek the will of God. The heart of the exercises is what Ignatius called the principle and foundation. Man was created to praise, reverence, and serve God, and thus save his soul, and all other things on earth are meant to assist him in that end. From this springs the fundamental attitude, to use things as long as they assist God, and to let them go when they hinder, without being disorderly attached to anything, seeking in everything what most leads to the end for which we were created. It is the freedom of the heart placed at the service of God. Throughout the weeks, the exercises lead the soul to contemplate sin and mercy, the life, passion, and resurrection of Christ. It's about looking at Jesus, knowing him intimately to love and follow him more, asking for internal knowledge of the Lord who became man for me, so that I may love and follow him more. It is not a knowledge of the mind, but a love of the heart that moves one to give their whole life in service to the eternal King. As a result of his experience in Manresa, Ignatius also gave the Church his rules for the discernment of spirits, that art of knowing the movements of the soul and distinguishing what comes from God from what comes from the enemy. He taught to recognize consolation, which brings one closer to God and leaves peace, and desolation, which distances one from him and sows unrest, and not to make important decisions in times of desolation, but with serenity and trust. This is a precious wisdom for all Christian life. Another Ignatian treasure is the daily examination of conscience, a brief look of the soul at the end of the day to thank God for his gifts, recognize faults, and propose to amend them. Ignatius considered it a practice of utmost importance, capable of transforming a life if done with fidelity. Through it, the Christian learns to walk in the presence of God and to seek and find him in all things, which is the very heart of Ignatius's teaching. All of this is summarized in a motto that Ignatius made his own and bequeathed to his followers: "For the greater glory of God." Goodness is not enough. One must always seek what pleases God the most and glorifies Him the most. With this spirit, the exercises have formed countless priests, religious and lay faithful over the centuries, and the Church has warmly recommended them. Strengthened with this treasure in his soul, Ignatius set out to fulfill his long-held dream, to pilgrimage to the Holy Land. After his stay in Manresa, Ignatius finally embarked on the journey he had long desired, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the land sanctified by the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord. He did so as a poor pilgrim, without money, completely trusting in providence for sustenance and passage. He wanted to tread the places where Jesus had lived, to behold with his own eyes the scenes of the gospel, and, if God allowed, to stay there to serve him and help souls. The journey was long and arduous, filled with difficulties, dangers, and deprivations. Ignatius boarded a ship, crossed the sea, and finally arrived at the holy city. With immense emotion, he visited the holy sites: Calvary, the Holy Sepulchre, the Mount of Olives, Bethlehem. Each step was a prayer for him, a meeting with the Lord to whom he had given his life. His heart, ignited with love, was filled with consolation as he traversed those blessed places. Ignatius wished to remain in the Holy Land forever, dedicated to prayer and the good of souls. But the Franciscan friars who guarded the holy sites did not allow him to do so. The situation was dangerous, and they feared for his life and potential conflicts that could arise. Authoritatively, they ordered him to return. Ignatius, who had made obedience one of his greatest virtues, humbly accepted that refusal, though it was difficult for him, seeing in it the will of God. Back in Europe, with his heart still set on the service of souls, Ignatius asked himself a decisive question. How could he truly help others, guide them toward God, teach them the faith if he himself lacked education and training? He understood that zeal for souls was not enough without the necessary knowledge to serve them well, and he made a resolution, as humble as it was courageous, to return to school, even as a mature man, to learn what he was missing. It was a heroic decision. A gentleman over 30, who had been a soldier and courtier, now sat on the school benches alongside children, learning the basics of Latin. He had to humble his pride, overcome his shame, and arm himself with patience. But nothing seemed too much for him if it meant equipping himself to better serve God and souls. In that humility, the greatness of the saint is revealed. Thus began a new and long phase of his life, that of a late student who, out of love for Christ, became a learner once more. This journey would take him through several cities in Spain and ultimately to the renowned University of Paris, where God had prepared for him a providential encounter with the first companions with whom he would found a new religious family. Let us follow his steps through the classrooms. Ignatius began his studies in Barcelona, learning Latin grammar alongside boys, with the simplicity of one who is not ashamed to start anew for the love of God. He also took the opportunity to discuss spiritual matters with anyone he could, guiding some people along the paths of prayer, already using his exercises. His zeal for souls did not rest, not even in the midst of his studies. He then moved on to the universities of Alcalá and Salamanca, where he continued his formation. However, his eagerness to teach the faith and direct souls, while still a man without titles or official authorization, raised suspicions. The ecclesiastical authorities, always vigilant in defending sound doctrine, examined him carefully, and on more than one occasion he was questioned and even detained to ensure that he was not teaching errors. Ignatius submitted peacefully and humbly to all the examinations. He never rebelled against the Church nor complained about those tests. On the contrary, he accepted them serenely, confident in his fidelity to the Catholic faith, and willing to obey the pastors in everything. From those trials, He always emerged with his doctrine intact, although he was required to wait until he completed his studies before guiding others. His love for the Church and his obedience to its pastors were always unbreakable, and in this he left a great example. Realizing that obstacles were being placed in his way in Spain, Ignatius decided to go to the University of Paris, then the most renowned in Christendom, to complete his training in philosophy and theology there. It was a new beginning, in a foreign land and amidst great hardships, as he continued to live on alms. With enormous effort and perseverance, he studied for several years until he obtained the degree of master. It was then that he adopted the name by which history would know him, Ignatius. In Paris, in addition to studying, Ignatius continued to do what he did best, win souls for God. He approached his fellow students, spoke with them, guided them through the spiritual exercises, and ignited in their hearts the desire to give themselves entirely to Christ. Little by little around him, a small group of brilliant and fervent young men was forming, captivated by his example and his words. God was quietly gathering the first companions. Among them were men who would become great saints and great apostles. Those students in Paris, united by friendship and a common ideal, were about to lay the foundations for a new religious family that would change the history of the Church. Before founding it, however, they would seal their commitment to God together in a solemn gesture on the hill of Montmartre. Let us get to know those first companions and that memorable vow. Among them were Pedro Fabro, a sweet and pious soul who would be the first to be ordained a priest, and above all, Francisco Javier, a brilliant and ambitious young man from Navarre, who shared a room with Ignacio. Francisco dreamed, like Ignacio in earlier times, of honors and fame, but Ignacio gradually won him over with that gospel question he repeated so often. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul? Matthew 16:26. With patience and perseverance, Ignacio made an impact on Francisco Javier's heart, until that brilliant young man also surrendered to Christ and gave up everything for him. Over time, Francisco Javier would become one of the greatest figures in history, bringing the gospel to India and the Far East, even to the gates of China. Thus, the conquest of one soul provided the Church with an immense apostle. Other young men of great worth joined the group, forming an initial core of 7 companions, united by friendship, shared ideals, and a common love for Christ. All had undergone the spiritual exercises under Ignacio's guidance, and all burned with the desire to dedicate themselves entirely to the service of God and souls. They were not merely a group of friends, but a brotherhood forged in prayer and the fire of the Spirit. On August 15th, 1534, the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin, those 7 companions climbed to the hill of Montmartre on the outskirts of Paris to a humble chapel. There, during the Holy Mass celebrated by Pedro Fabro, now a priest, they made vows of poverty and chastity together, and promised to pilgrimage to Jerusalem to work for the salvation of souls, and if this were not possible, to place themselves at the disposal of the Pope for whatever he wished to command them. This was the seed of the future society of Jesus. That vow at Montmartre sealed the union of the small group and definitively directed their lives. They would no longer live for themselves, but for God and the Church. Their total availability, placed in the hands of the successor of Peter, would be one of the distinguishing features of the work they were about to establish. In that hidden chapel, the heart of a great apostolic enterprise was already beating, although they themselves could not fully grasp its significance. The following years were ones of waiting and preparation. The companions completed their studies, were ordained as priests, and tried to fulfill their promise to go to Jerusalem. But wars made the journey impossible. Then, faithful to their promise, they headed to Rome to place themselves at the feet of the Pope. On the way, Ignacio would receive a singular grace, and in the eternal city, the Society of Jesus would officially be born. On the way to Rome, in a small chapel at a place called La Storta, Ignacio received a grace that filled him with comfort. He felt deeply that God the Father was placing him alongside his Son, who bore the cross, and that he promised to be favorable to him in Rome. That experience confirmed Ignacio on his path and gave him the certainty that God blessed the work that was about to be born. He knew himself to be associated with Christ, who carries the cross, to serve his church. Upon arriving in Rome, Ignacio and his companions placed themselves at the disposal of Pope Paul III, ready to do whatever he commanded for the good of the church. They dedicated themselves to preaching, teaching doctrine, and serving the poor and the sick, bearing witness to a holy life. It was a difficult time for the church, wounded by divisions and in need of reform, and those fervent priests, loyal to the Pope, were a gift from heaven in that hour. To give stability to their work, the companions deliberated at length and decided to form a new religious order with a stable bond among them, under a superior and with vows entirely at the service of the Roman pontiff. They wanted to call it the Society of Jesus, taking the name from the Lord himself because they did not wish to serve any other captain but Christ. They added to the usual vows a special vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions, to go wherever he sent them for the good of souls. On September 27, 1540, Pope Paul III officially approved the new order through a solemn document, granting it canonical existence in the Church. Thus, the Society of Jesus was born, the Jesuits, called to be a spiritual militia in the service of the Vicar of Christ. That former soldier who had dreamed of earthly armies was now founding an army of the Spirit, whose weapons were preaching, the sacraments, teaching, and dedication to souls. The following year, his companions unanimously elected Ignatius as the first superior general of the society. He, out of humility, resisted as much as he could, for he did not believe himself worthy to govern others. But finally he accepted, seeing in that election the will of God. From then on, until his death, he governed the society from Rome with firmness and sweetness, like a father who loves his children and guides them toward holiness. Under his leadership, the new order grew with astonishing speed. In just a few years, the Jesuits spread across Europe and to the newly discovered distant lands, bringing the gospel to the most remote peoples. What had begun with 7 companions in a chapel in Montmartre was becoming a great work in service of the universal church. Let us see how Ignatius spent the last years of his life leading that growing family. From Rome, Ignatius directed the Society of Jesus for 15 years until the end of his life. Although he was a man of action and great enterprises, he spent those years primarily in prayer, governance, and hidden work, dedicated to consolidating the work that God had entrusted to him. He maintained extensive correspondence with his children scattered around the world, encouraging them, advising them, and guiding them with wisdom and a father's love. One of his great works was sending missionaries to the ends of the earth. He sent his beloved Francis Xavier to India and the East, and from there the saintly missionary baptized multitudes and brought the faith to Japan, writing one of the most glorious chapters of evangelization. Other Jesuits set out for America, Africa, and the most distant corners, driven by zeal for souls and by that motto of giving God the greatest glory. Ignatius also understood, with remarkable clarity, the importance of Christian education. Under his impetus, the society founded numerous schools and universities, where young people were trained in science and virtue, in faith and in the humanities. These centers of study became one of the great instruments of the society for the good of the church and society, and for centuries formed countless Christians. Teaching was one of their favorite weapons to serve Christ. During those years, Ignatius also dedicated himself to composing the constitutions of the society. the set of rules that were to govern the new order and guide its members along the path of holiness and service. He wrote them with great care, the result of much prayer and discernment, seeking in everything the will of God. In them, he embodied the spirit that was to animate the Jesuits: total availability, obedience, dedication to souls, and the constant pursuit of the greater glory of God. Ignatius did everything with one eye on God and the other on the needs of the Church. He lived in times of great turmoil, when the unity of Christendom had been broken and many were turning away from the faith. The Society of Jesus was, in that hour, a firm support for the Church and the Pope, working for the reform of morals, firmness in doctrine, and the renewal of Christian life. Ignacio and his companions devoted themselves wholeheartedly to this great task. Amidst so many works, Ignacio never lost his connection with God. Those who knew him testified that he was a man of continuous prayer, who found God in all things, and who shed abundant tears of devotion while celebrating the Holy Mass. His intense activity flowed from a deep inner life, like a river springs from a source. Thus, serving the Church with all his soul, he approached the end of his pilgrimage on earth. Let us contemplate his holy death and his glory. Worn down by years, work, and penance, Ignacio gradually weakened. On July 31st, 1556, in Rome, he peacefully surrendered his soul to God, without grand gestures, with the same simplicity with which he had lived his last years. He died as he had lived, seeking in all things the glory of God. That soldier wounded in Pamplona, who became a soldier of Christ, completed his course and received the crown promised to faithful servants. The fame of his holiness, and above all the immense fruit of his work, prompted the Church to examine his life and virtues. He was declared blessed, and finally, on March 12, 1622, Pope Gregory XV solemnly enrolled him in the catalogue of saints, alongside his great companion Francis Xavier and other distinguished saints of that time. In this way, the Church publicly and definitively recognized the heroic holiness of the founder of the Society of Jesus. His feast is celebrated every July 31st, and his figure continues to radiate light over the Church. The Society of Jesus he founded has given rise to countless saints, missionaries, martyrs, scholars, and pastors over the centuries, and continues to work today around the world. And the spirituality that Ignacio taught, with his exercises and his discernment, continues to guide countless souls toward God. The Church has especially proposed him as the patron of spiritual exercises and retreats. From his life flow precious teachings for today. The first is that no one is so far from God that they cannot convert. Ignacio was a worldly, vain, ambitious man, and God transformed him into a great saint. His story tells us that grace can take our passions and energies, however disordered they may be, and direct them toward good. What needed to change was not the strength of his heart, but the goal, and God gave him an infinite goal. He also teaches us the value of discernment, the art of reading the movements of the soul to seek God's will in all things. In a world filled with voices and haste, Ignacio invites us to pause, to examine our hearts, to distinguish what draws us closer to God from what drives us away from Him, and to decide with serenity and confidence. The daily examination, attentive prayer, the search for the greater glory of God. Here is a sure path to Christian living, and he teaches us above all to give everything for Christ, without reservations, seeking in everything what glorifies him the most. For the greater glory of God. This motto, which summarizes his life, can also summarize ours. May Saint Ignacio grant us a generous heart, capable of surrendering to Christ as he did, and of serving God and souls with all our soul. Let us place ourselves under his protection with a trusting prayer which captures the spirit of his famous prayer of surrender. Glorious Saint Ignatius of Loyola, wounded soldier who surrendered to Christ and exchanged the glory of the world for the greater glory of God. Grant me the grace of true conversion, so that I too may leave my vanities and dedicate my entire life to the service of the Lord. You who learn to seek and find God in all things, and to discern in your heart the voice of the good Spirit, teach me to pause and look at my soul, to distinguish what brings me closer to God from what separates me from Him, and to always seek with serenity His holy will. You who founded a great family in service to the Church and sent your children to the ends of the earth, ignite in me the zeal for the salvation of souls, love for the Church, and fidelity to the successor of Peter, so that I may work, according to my state, for the kingdom of God. Receive, Lord, through His intercession, my freedom, my memory, my understanding, and my will. Everything I have and possess you gave me, and to you, Lord, I return it. Give me only your love and your grace, for that is enough for me. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, master of the exercises and father of countless souls, pray for me, so that living and dying for Christ, I may deserve to behold Him one day in the glory of heaven, for His greater glory and for all eternity. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.